All right, it's 2 o'clock. So to be respectful of everyone's time, I want to go ahead and get started on the webinar and participants can join in as they come. So hi, everyone. Welcome to our new research webinar series. I'm Dr. Andrea Kretz, and I'm the research chair for the Sawfish Conservation Society. Today is Endangered Species Day, and this is the perfect time for us to launch this new webinar series where we have researchers and conservationists around the world speak to us about their research on sawfishes. Today's speaker is Matthew McDavitt. He is a board member of the Sawfish Conservation Society, and he documents the cultural importance of the shark-like rays, particularly sawfishes, wedgefish, and guitarfish. Matthew's research seeks to detail the art, mythology, symbolism, trade, and other uses of these unique fishes. And he was the 2008 winner of the Peter Benchley Shark Conservation Award for his work documenting sawfish trade. Most recently, Matthew employed his cultural expertise to locate 24 wild range records for the newly described and virtually unknown clown wedgefish, which is super cool, and I would love to hear more about that at another time. So today, Matthew will share the details from more than 2 decades of research on the cultural importance of sawfishes. I just want to make a note that this webinar is being recorded and it will be posted later on the Sawfish Conservation Society YouTube page. And then I ask that you also please hold your questions to the end, where you can either type them in the chat box or you can raise your hand and Matthew will address those questions. So with that, Matthew, you can take over the controls.
Excellent. So can people see that screen? Great. Yeah, so I am on the Sawfish Conservation Society board, and my background, however, is very different than the other members of that society. My background is not in zoology, but in anthropology and archaeology, studying the modern and ancient cultural value of the rhinopristiforms, covering sawfish, wedgefish, and guitarfish. And cultural history covers anything that societies do with an animal, and that could be, what their common names are, art and symbolism, mythology, and the subject of this talk, of course, is commercial trade in products made from these animals. So, for instance, I talk to people in different cultures about what the value of sawfish is to them, and any mythology or any art, legends, what they know about them, as far as how they catch them and what they use them for. And so that's my background, is I really study the cultural importance of the shark-like rays, and that will be the subject of this talk, regarding specifically how they've been used in trade. So sawfish's traditional range was the tropics and subtropic coastlines, but their population has suffered massive declines over most of their range over the past at least 50 years. And nowadays, a lot of sawfish populations have crashed, and people have not seen them in a lot of coastlines for, in some cases, 30, 40, or 50 years. And right now, the areas that you see on the map that are encompassed by the yellow boxes are the only places that sawfishes have stable and decent populations right now, and that's the southern tip of Florida, and then the northern coast of Australia and parts of Papua New Guinea. And everywhere else, we've seen incredible population declines of sawfish populations globally. And one of the major reasons for that is the introduction of cheap monofilament nylon gill nets. That happened about 1950, and we start to see many more nets deployed in many areas of the world as these cheap, light, durable nets become available, much cheaper and much easier to manage than the heavy cotton and hemp nets that preceded them. And so you see a lot more nets in the water, and unfortunately sawfishes are disproportionately vulnerable to any sort of capture in nets because of their rostrum. You couldn't design something that would be more apt to be permanently caught in a net. And for instance, this is well known even in tribal societies. There's a culture in Cameroon and Central Africa that has a proverb, the saw of the sawfish has killed it. And that is applied when someone does something single-mindedly and it ends in their death. And recognizing the vulnerability that is unique to sawfish is that if they encounter a net, they're not getting out of it, and it leads to their demise. But aside from wide availability of cheap gill nets, the other thing that crashed their populations in part was them being actually targeted in many parts of the world for various products, some of which obscenely expensive. And so that has also driven the decline of sawfishes. And before we get off the slide, this picture here with all the sawfish, this was a 3-hour net set for a fishing expedition in Florida that caught 34 sawfish. You can see how many animals can be removed from the environment in just a very brief net set. That's how vulnerable sawfishes are, and how many animals can be taken out in even just one net set. So the first product that we'll discuss is sawfish leather. Sawfishes have been used for a variety of purposes throughout their range, and in some cases these have gone to a commercial extent, and one of these is sawfish leather. And this business operated throughout the 1920s and into the early 1930s in Florida. There were at least 2 businesses that were based in Big Pine Key, and they figured out, after tooling around in their boats and trying to find the best areas to catch sharks, various types for their leather making business, figured out that sawfishes were incredibly plentiful and in Cape Sable. And so they would actually apparently deploy 2 or 3 60-foot nets pretty much every day around Cape Sable and collect sawfishes for this business. Sawfishes were admired for the leather trade because they have a very broad body, so you could get much larger swaths of good leather compared to traditional sharks. And they graded them in 3 categories, which don't make a lot of sense to us now. Eastern, nurse, of course, presumably nurse sharks, and sawfish, which was the best quality leather. And what's interesting is that, what they were using them for is they were using them to make high quality dress shoes and also cowboy boots. And this business apparently did pretty well for a while. But you can see if you look at this photograph, so here's a capture of sawfish, probably from a net set. It's hard to count because they're all jumbled together, but it looks like there might be 11 or 12 sawfishes there. But what's interesting is circled in the yellow here, you can see they're harvesting something else along with the leather. They're harvesting the shark fins, which in their range everywhere around the world where they caught sawfish for whatever purpose, most people knew to process the fins and sell them, because that is by and far the most expensive, valuable product you can get from sawfish. So here they're certainly collecting the sawfish fins. What killed this industry, though short-lived as it was the stock market crash in 1929. And soon after, all the shark leather businesses went out of business because the luxury products like shark leather shoes were not something that people had the money to spend on anymore. And so that business died. And certainly all around the globe where sawfishes exist, people have caught them, and they get caught in nets even by accident. And people, of course, use sawfishes for meat. Sawfishes can be very large, and they can supply a huge amount of meat for a community. And so they, of course, use them when they catch them. It's not super high value or high quality meat, but it's good, and people do exploit it. If you catch a sawfish and it's a female, they can have a suite of ovarian eggs, and they're about the size of grapefruits. They're enormous, and those are also prized. People will cook them or eat them raw. So here we have a huge large-tooth sawfish caught maybe a decade ago on the coast of Borneo in Malaysia. And you can see that they're processing the meat, and you can see there's just enormous slabs of meat that they can distribute for the community. And on the left here, we see 2 frozen bodies of knife-tooth sawfish, Anoxopristis cuspidata, caught off Bali, and these are being used for meat. And they've also, you can see, cut off the saws, so they're using the rostra, probably for sale to tourists. But the most interesting study we have on sawfish meat comes from Lake Nicaragua. I was in Lake Nicaragua the summer of 1998, and I was with a group that was trying to figure out if sawfishes and bull sharks still existed in that lake. There was a huge fishery for large-toothed sawfish and bull sharks in Lake Nicaragua throughout the entire 1970s decade. And they were processing multiple products, but the most expensive product, again, was the sawfish fins. But they were also, interestingly, harvesting the meat. And the meat was used locally, but they were also exporting it. And I have found records that there was meat from Lake Nicaragua sawfish going to the Midwest of the United States in supermarkets. So here, circled in the red here, you see that they're selling Sierra steaks. Sierra is the Spanish word for saw, and these were Lake Nicaragua sawfish steaks. And they were also using the sawfish meat to process fish sticks in America. So we actually had export of Lake Nicaragua sawfish meat for grocery store food, basically, in America. So I was there, and we set nets for sawfish and the bull sharks, and we never saw any, but I was able to talk to several of the fishermen, including this guy at the bottom. He was a participant in the 1970s sawfish trade, and he told me that nowadays the fishermen, including him, no longer can fish for the bull sharks and the sawfish because the populations absolutely crashed by about 1980, and they haven't recovered, although they're setting nets in similar areas, in similar net mesh sizes, but now catching other species for food like tropical gar and tarpon. And they still occasionally bycatch sawfish in these nets. So they're still there, but he says they're incredibly rare. He still sees baby sawfish sometimes in the margins around the islands, particular islands. He says that he has seen them both mating and giving birth in the lake. But unfortunately, Lake Nicaragua has been completely depleted of the sawfish and the bull sharks. And the picture at the bottom here, those are two Lake Nicaragua bull sharks that were caught I think 2 years after I was there. And so we were based in a research station along an island in the middle of the lake made up of two volcanoes. The island is called Ometepe, which is interesting because that's the Aztec word for two mountains. And so yeah, these two bull sharks were caught just offshore of our research station a couple years after I was there. And in fact, the year before I was there, a kid of about 10 or 12 years old was cleaning out a fishing net on the shore, and or just in the water, maybe 2 or 3 feet of water, and he was bitten by a bull shark and died. So the animals are still there, but they're incredibly rare now. Again, the most important commercial product coming out of Lake Nicaragua and what really spurred the trade was the high value shark fin, because as we'll talk about in a little bit here, sawfish fins are among the highest value fish products that have ever existed. There was a study of the trade in the 1970s in Lake Nicaragua by the great ichthyologist Thorson, and he estimated, based on fishery records, that 100,000 sawfish were taken from that lake in the decade between 1970 and 1980. And here, for instance, at the bottom is a quotation from another ichthyologist who was examining this trade about halfway through, acknowledging that a lot of the animals are taken because of the high value of the fins in the Asian shark fin trade. So now we can talk about shark fin trade. This is not well studied. It's because it's very high value and some of it is illegal. People who participate in the trade are extremely reticent to talk about it, so it's extremely hard to research. But essentially, shark fin is one of these very high value luxury foods that emerged in Chinese cuisine maybe 600 years ago, but it really took off about 1800. And so there's a whole suite of fishery products that are deemed in Chinese lore the 8 treasures of the sea, and they're very high value. They're appreciated for their sublime textures, and China has a very sophisticated palate regarding textures of foods in a way that the West doesn't really have at all. So they appreciate a whole range of textures we don't have names for. And so some of these high value products are abalone, trepang, which is sea slugs, bird nest soup, which is technically not a sea product, but they classify it that way. And one of the most expensive is shark fin. And what they use are the ceratotrichia, the stiffening cartilaginous fibers that are inside of certain shark. I mean, all shark fins have them, but the ones that have it the most are the shark-like rays, the sawfish, guitarfish, wedgefish. Very costly. It's mostly imported from Indonesia and Malaysia, and of course other tropical coastlines globally. As populations crash, they would look elsewhere in different parts of the world and collect them as far afield as Florida, Nicaragua, Venezuela, and of course all over Asia. It's very, very difficult to investigate the shark fin trade because it's extremely high value, and the people that participate in it as collecting the animals, processing the animals, there's various trade routes they go through. These fins can actually change hands 10 or 15 times before they're exported out of the catch country. So it's extremely hard to investigate the trade, and people are very, very loath to discuss it. So for instance, here's some of the things I've figured out anecdotally. A lot of the high value shark fin, which includes the sawfish, the wedgefish, the guitarfish, are landed at private docks. Certain buyers who deal with the really high value fin, like certain restaurants and traders, they will have standing orders for particular fins. So they'll go to specific buyers. So they're not just like advertising them and selling them in the public. Unlike standard shark fin from, say, carchariniform sharks, the high value ray fin is usually not sold at public auctions, so you're not seeing it in the reported studies of what's being sold at these auctions. The sellers and suppliers and the buyers do not want their trade routes, their locations where they're finding abundant sawfish and wedgefish known to even other traders, so they keep it secret. So traders are wary of course, other competitors in the shark fin trade. They, of course, since about the 1990s at least, they're very wary of Western environmentalists trying to investigate this trade. So it's very hard to get details about this trade. What I figured out is the following. The highest value fin is all the ray fin. So particularly Pristis genus sawfish, Anoxopristis, knife-toothed sawfish, all species of wedgefish, all species of Glaucostegus, and the bizarre Rhina ankylostoma. And all of these are the very high value shark fin. And in fact, as one trader told me, this is the caviar of shark fin. So there's standard shark fin, which is decent, but the stuff that's super expensive and super high quality and the most luxurious version comes from the shark-like rays. So what people are actually eating is basically noodles. So you see up here at the top left, this is what sawfish, wedgefish, rhina, ceratotrichia look like. They're these huge, thick, succulent noodles, basically, whereas standard sharks have the same thing, but they're much smaller and not as succulent, and the texture is not as good. So the Chinese trade separates shark fin into two categories: yellowfin, which are all the high value rays I just talked about. It's called yellowfin because Pristis genus sawfish tend to have very yellow fins, so the whole class is called that. Whereas carchariniform shark fin is called blackfin because they're sort of this steel gray color. And interestingly, the only carchariniform shark that ever appears in the high grade category is sandbar sharks, which have better ceratotrichia than standard carchariniform sharks. And you can see how the quality of the high value fin, for instance, here's Rhina ankylostoma, and you can see that its fin has so many of these transparent stiffening ceratotrichia in it that it's actually translucent. So the yellow fin, the fin coming from the rays, is the really high value fin. So a lot of this trade occurred in Indonesia and Malaysia. And this, it's always been a product that was traded since at least 500 or 600 years ago, but it really took off in the mid-1980s. And the reason was China relaxed economic controls in its borders, and this allowed a lot more people to have more money. So you got an emerging middle class in China, and they wanted to sample the high-value luxury foods that the upper class had access to, and one of those was shark fin. So starting in about the mid-1980s, you saw a huge new demand for shark fin and more money in China and in Chinese communities elsewhere wanting this product. And so what happened is fishermen were deployed throughout, starting in the Strait of Malacca between Peninsular Malaysia and Singapore, and they were particularly looking for sawfish and wedgefish that are very high quality and high value in the trade. So this led to a lot of net fishing for the shark fin species, and this led very quickly to them being overexploited. And so what happened is in this new shark fin trade boom, the fishermen started moving eastward gradually from place to place, looking for the high value species, particularly the sawfish and the wedgefish. And they kept moving over about a period of a decade further east and east until they ended up in the Arafura Sea, which was well known for hundreds of years of being particularly rich in sawfish and wedgefish in its shallow, muddy seas. And so we saw this massive exploitation of sharks, and particularly sawfish and wedgefish. So as nowadays, wedgefish are still doing okay, but they're down about maybe 60, 70% from the former numbers, but sawfish have pretty much disappeared. Even in the last 10 years, I've seen it worse, where I'm seeing a lot less records of sawfish even being caught anywhere in Indonesia. So the shark fin trade really collapsed populations, particularly of sawfish. And this was not lost on the people who really love this trade, who, for instance, in some areas, they say that the absolute best shark fin is Pristis genus sawfish fin. For instance, here we see a shop in Sabah, Malaysia, and you can see they've got the fins of a green sawfish. They've got a sawfish snout from both a large tooth sawfish and a green sawfish. And they've also got another high value luxury product, which is fish maw, which is certain swim bladders, particularly of fishes like croakers that are, again, a very high value texture food in China. And so, they're advertising that they've got this high value fin. This is Pristis genus sawfish fin. This is from Pristis zeisseron, green sawfish. This is from a shark fin catalog. I started investigating this trade 30 years ago. And so in the, early on, I was able to actually access catalogs from some of these sawfish or some of these shark fin traders, and was able to get their catalogs and their trade names and stuff. But all of those sites have disappeared, 20 years ago. And now they're very careful that they don't put information out in public. So for instance, it was known that Pristis genus sawfish fin was very high quality, and particularly interestingly, they have sub-geographic trade names where they recognize that certain regions were even better, had a better quality sawfish fin than even generally. And so, for instance, once these sawfish fins became hard to get, here's a translation of a connoisseur who was lamenting that after the sawfish populations crashed in Indonesia and Malaysia, that she couldn't find sawfish fin to buy anymore at the restaurants. And she said, generally, Pristis is best, but very rare now. Maybe it's 4 centimeter thick fin meat, and its toothpick thick fin needles can only be seen in dreams. So they're lamenting the fact that the really high quality product is no longer available. And just to show, as far afield as Madagascar, they've recognized that in the trade, the sawfish fin was very high value. So here's a prior, now defunct website that was selling shark fin from Madagascar, and they recognize sawfish fin provides better shark fin than ordinary sharks. All right, so the next product I'll talk about is Sawfish rostra, the saws. I did a study on this back in 2004 on eBay, which at the time had the most incidence of sales of Sawfish rostra. And I found that an average of 210 were sold globally per year on eBay. Average sale price was about $120 US. and the total annual sales was somewhere over $25,000. So 36% of it transported it internationally. Really large saws that were maybe over 5 feet could get really high prices, but generally the price was, you know, about $120 a piece on average. The volume seemed relatively low, and there was no evidence that people were catching them and then selling the fresh saws. So it seems to be mostly older trophies that were being resold as people cleaned out their houses and whatever. So it does not seem that the rostra trade is driving exploitation of sawfish at this point. So that's trade in the rostra. Of course, sawfishes are very popular in aquariums, and they're in dozens of aquariums currently, and they can be a great ambassador to get people interested in sawfish who may have never heard of them, because they can see them live and they're pretty interesting and compelling to view, and a lot of people enjoy watching them. At least one facility, the Atlantis Paradise Aquarium in the Bahamas, has an open air, shallow habitat for captivity for sawfish, and they've actually seen pups born in 2012. So that's interesting that there might be possibilities of captive breeding if people pursue that. They're held in dozens of public aquaria globally. Each animal can cost tens of thousands of dollars. The pricing is very hard to come by. I've heard that, you know, some people sell them for, you know, more than $10,000 a foot, but I haven't been able to verify that. They do have great educational value, and it's a great way to get people interested in them. The oldest sawfish I know of in captivity was a small-tooth sawfish named Mr. Bill that was formerly held in an aquarium, the Aquarium of the Americas in Louisiana, but it was unfortunately killed during Hurricane Katrina when it cut the power, and a lot of the captive animals were killed. And there was another one, green sawfish in South Africa, that survived for, I think, 34 years. So they can live a long time. Interestingly, there was a very short-lived trade in Sumatra, Indonesia, where there was a company that was collecting sawfish in several rivers in fresh water in Sumatra and selling them, mostly, interestingly, to private home aquariums and private business aquariums. And I found records that they were at least sent to America, Singapore, Taiwan, Japan, and Germany. This trade operated at least through the 1990s. And then I heard that it collapsed because they couldn't catch sawfish reliably enough to supply to their customers. And you can see here's customer photos of their outdoor private aquariums. And you can see they've also got South American stingrays. So they're keeping them in fresh water. And so that's an interesting private trade that, you know, we haven't heard much about. And I don't know if that's occurred anywhere else, but that's an interesting trade. And I have been looking at that region recently, and, you know, the sawfish are just not being caught anymore, even though there's extensive net fishing in those rivers. And of course, that's probably why the sawfish disappeared, is they just overexploited them, given how vulnerable sawfishes are to entanglement in any sort of nets, even if they're not, of course, set trying to catch sawfish. The price in this trade was about 5,000 US dollars each, plus shipping. And apparently the scale of the trade was pretty low. From what I heard, it was 20 or less sawfishes annually. But it's interesting to see that private trade, because that's a trade that I hadn't encountered before. An interesting trade that was enigmatic for me for a while was, if you go to Taiwan, you can see in certain temples they have sawfish snouts displayed, and you can see people doing things with sawfish snouts. So I was wondering, you know, what's that about? And so, investigating that, I found out that there is a trade, a long-standing trade that goes back probably a couple hundred years, where a byproduct of the now Indonesian and Malaysian shark fin trade was a trade in rostra of animals that were caught that were being sold to Taiwan. And so that made me wonder what they are being used for. Here, for instance, just a couple years ago, this is part of a seizure of 170 saws that were caught being smuggled into Taiwan in 2021. So what are they doing with these things? I was able to investigate this and found out that they're ceremonial weapons. So essentially in Chinese cosmology, there is this idea that there are ghosts that are people that have died that are not being taken care of in the afterlife. They believe that if you have a loved one that dies, you have to supply them with food offerings and burn what they call hell money, which is this yellow paper money with little gold strips on it that you burn for them. And that gives them money and food, and they burn replicas of cars and other things to supply their dead relatives in the afterlife with objects and food and money. And they think that if these ghosts are not taken care of, they become dangerous and are injurious to living people, and they can cause things like general misfortune, disease, car accidents, injuries, any sort of bad luck can be caused by these ghosts. And so they have trained spirit mediums that can commune with certain gods, and they can use stylized dances with a variety of ceremonial weapons, including Sawfish rostra, to battle these deleterious ghosts that can plague mankind and cause problems for them. And thus Sawfish saws are very valuable because it's the only natural product that can repel these ghosts. And for instance, here's two prices I found in my research. This one large tooth saw, temple saw with some gold ornaments on it, sold for almost $50,000 US, and another pair of temple saws sold made out of green sawfish saws for over $80,000 US. So these temple saws can be very valuable. And so what their cosmology says is Chinese cosmology breaks everything into two categories. There's a binary of yin and yang. And yin has a suite of characteristics associated with it, and yang has a suite of characteristics that it represents. And ghosts are part of the yin, dark side of the world. And so you repel them with yang products or energy. And so what the spirit mediums are doing is they hit themselves with these ceremonial weapons, because male blood, being young, will actually repel the yin ghosts. So they do these stylized dances with Sawfish rostra, and they hit themselves in the head or in the back, and they draw blood. And this blood, they can use the blood to paint charms that will repel the ghosts and the demons. And they can just draw it generally, which will make basically like a force field that will repel ghosts from the area. And women participate in this too, not quite to the extent as men do, but they use these weapons too. And you can see she's got this suite of blood drawing weapons that she uses on herself, including a hafted, handled Anaxipristis knife-tooth sawfish rostrum. What we're seeing in this trade is that in recent years, maybe in the last decade or so, we're seeing a rise of metal replicas of sawfish saws to be used in this fashion, because it's getting harder and harder to get the sawfish rostra, the actual saws. There was also a small trade in medicinal products made from sawfishes, mostly their sawfish rostra, but also various products like ova. And so here's, for instance, a page from a Chinese medical almanac that talks about all the different medical benefits of various sawfish products, from Anaxipristis cuspidata. As Patricia Charvet has documented, there is a trade in sawfish rostra for medicinal uses in Brazil. I found in Bangladesh that there are traditional medicine sellers that are using sawfish rostra for medicinal purposes. So here's a juvenile large tooth sawfish, and then the edge of a large tooth sawfish rostra, and he scrapes powder off of these and makes medicines locally. And so there is this medicinal trade that certainly has gone on for hundreds of years in many parts of the world where sawfish are common. But from what I understand, it seems to be relatively low volume in the areas that I've looked at. So it remains unknown exactly how prevalent these trades are and if they're a significant threat to sawfish populations. But certainly, given that sawfish populations have crashed globally, any use could be detrimental, and so people should be keeping track of that so that we understand what sort of products are being used for sawfish. And then the last one I'll talk about here is an interesting one. I came across this trade maybe 15 or 20 years ago. Bizarrely, they use sawfish teeth in the cockfighting trade in Peru. And Peru is interesting in that in most countries that use or that have a cockfighting trade, they use metal or plastic spurs. What they do is they take the natural spur off of a rooster's leg, and then they replace it with an artificial spur that's bigger and more damaging. And in most parts of the world that use that, they use plastic spurs or metal spurs. Peru has a rule in their sport that you can't use any artificial product. It has to be natural products. And so what they did is they looked at a variety of natural products like various antlers, bones, stingray spines, sawfish teeth, various teeth of other animals. And after trying all these array of animal products, they figured out that sawfish teeth was the best product. It lasted the longest without breaking. It kept its point more, and it did something interesting that they called posanyosa, which means venomous. And they say that even when it's cut down and sanded into, from raw sawfish teeth into these, these conical spines, that it still has this surface property that does more damage to flesh than just a normal object with that same shape. And they call that posanyosa, venomous. So it does some sort of flesh damage, which is interesting. There may be some characteristic in the structure of sawfish teeth that actually does more damage to something that hits it. Maybe that's part of the value of rostral teeth to the sawfish, and that hasn't been studied. So in other countries that do cockfighting, they use metal spurs or they use plastic spurs, but in the Peruvian trade, they don't allow any artificial materials. And so they really like the sawfish teeth. And so there's this continued trade in sawfish. And so we're seeing the sawfish being sourced from Brazil and from other Caribbean countries, certainly Panama, some of the coastal countries on the north of South America. And so there's this trade in these sawfish spurs. Let me go back. And they can cost a lot of money. So you can actually find that these spurs generally are priced at about $200 per pair. And a pair of spurs comes from 1/2 of a rostral tooth. So that means one rostral tooth is worth about $400 retail. So you can imagine that there's a significant trade going on as people want to capitalize on this market. And so that's another trade of concern, because I've actually been contacted myself because I published some stuff on sawfish and I've got stuff online. I used to have a website about sawfish, and I used to periodically get traders from Peru contacting me to see if I had any sawfish saws that I could sell them. So that's just another trade, commercial product that endangers sawfish, because there's so many different valuable products that come from these animals, and creates a financial incentive for people to continue to catch them, especially now that they're much rarer. So we're actually driving up the price because the animals have been so depleted now that people are willing to pay a lot more for the fins, for the saws, for the other products that sawfishes have been used for. And so that is the presentation. I'll be happy to answer any questions if people have them.
Thank you, Matthew, for that very interesting and informative talk. I really enjoyed seeing that and learning about the sawfish trade that happens across the globe. So if anyone has any questions, you can raise your hand and we can call on you that way. Or if you'd like to write a question in the chat box, you can do it that way as well. I'll have a question for you, Matthew. You kind of answered it a little bit there at the end, but I was wondering, watching this presentation with the increased awareness that we have all been bringing to sawfishes across the globe, if you have seen a decline in trade, or conversely, have you seen an increase of trade because it would drive the prices up?
It's really hard to say. It's very hard to, I mean, I can certainly come across sites of shark fin traders or, other groups, but they're very reticent to discuss anything. So they certainly don't answer questions, and they're so concerned about competition within their own trade. They don't talk about where they get things, what their pricing is, what the scale of it is. I've certainly seen, social media posts from some people lamenting that they can't find sawfish anymore. But I don't know if those are traders or just people that, enjoyed catching them. So it's really difficult. Maybe, 15, 20 years ago, I was able to find, shark fin companies that had catalogs of what they offered and pricing and trade names and all sorts of things. And luckily I saved all those things, because nowadays they're very careful not to put anything out there. I think because there's so much more scrutiny given the concern starting, in the 1970s regarding wildlife trade, that they've gradually caught on that they need to be careful about what they put out there, because people will find it and, harass them about it. So it's really hard to tell scale wise, except seeing things like, like that Sumatran private aquarium trade, where I found discussions of it where they said it's gone because they couldn't catch any more animals, that kind of thing. And certainly we're seeing things like wedge fish in Indonesia and Malaysia. We've seen their numbers fall substantially, and that's absolutely driven by the shark fin trade, that there's a drive to get these high value species. And because the sawfishes have basically been eradicated throughout most of their range, and they just can't see them in predictable numbers anymore, they've really just ramped up catching what they can catch, which the wedge fish are doing better than the sawfish. But we're seeing huge catches of wedge fish now because they're compensating for all those other fin types that are no longer available.
Thank you. Yes, Vicente, you can unmute yourself. Thanks.
Hi, Matt. Thank you
Hey.
very much. Wonderful talk. Matt, I was so surprised about those 170 saws that you show us. They were caught in Taiwan.
Well, they weren't caught in Taiwan. They were shipped there from Indonesia,
shipped.
probably. Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing. Like,
It's a byproduct of the shark fin trade. And that was just one that they caught. That was just one shipment that export import investigators found. And if you go to temples in Taiwan, almost all of them have sawfish saws, and of course some of them can be hundreds of years old. But there is a trade for that, and that seizure of 170 saws was just one example of it. Probably 1% of what's going in there. We have no idea, but every once in a while we come across something that shows us that this is a significant trade, and where are they all coming from? And what I hear is it's coming from Indonesia. It's a byproduct of the shark fin trade. They sell the fins, and then they also sell the saws.
Just a question. Any chance they could be from recent populations? It's just going on. They just collect.
Oh yeah, I mean, in a shipment like that,
months?
they're absolutely recently caught. They're
Amazing.
not
Wow.
hoarding them, in a warehouse and 20 years later selling them. They're literally a byproduct. When they catch animals in the shark fin trade, they'll sell the fins to various Chinese dealers, and then they'll ship the saws to Taiwan.
My God, thanks so
So
much.
it just shows us that somewhere they're catching lots of Anoxopristis sawfish somewhere still. And I hear rumors, like I heard a rumor, for instance, that the Paracel Islands, below China, is a very good place for Anoxopristis from shark fin dealers. If that's true or not, I have no idea, but I've heard that multiple times.
Thank you very much, man.
Yeah, yeah.
Louise, go ahead. And apologies if I pronounced anyone's name incorrectly.
Hello. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. I was it was very helpful. I'm a young scientist that is starting to work with shark and ranks conservation, elastic ranks conservation.
Great.
And I just have a question. Like in my country, I'm located in Venezuela,
Sure.
South Caribbean, and in the country, Sawfish was declared as an extinct species. And nonetheless, several fishermen have stated that they usually see them near mangrove or coastal lagoons.
Yeah.
So even they know that this is a threatened species and they shouldn't capture it. So they're very jealous of giving up of saying stuff about the animals.
Yeah.
How can I start doing research on these animals? And how can I approach them? Or what advice would you give to start like to start working with these communities and to start finding out what's going on? Where are the sawfish?
Yeah, I think that when you work with fishers, if you can talk to them about what they do and get their trust, I think a lot of fishers do care about healthy populations of fish. And of course, sawfishes are very charismatic. And I certainly know a lot of researchers have had luck just building a rapport with fishers and letting them know that, hey, you know, we could really benefit from your knowledge and your data. If you can tell us where you're seeing them and what you see, and giving us that data that we can help them. And if the fishers aren't interested in actually catching them, which, you know, usually they wouldn't be once they recognize that, you know, they're endangered, a lot of them, I think, get some satisfaction of participating in that research if you have a rapport with them. So I think that's been used in a lot of different countries successfully.
My issue with them, but not my issue, sorry. English is not my mother language, so I don't have like the right words for it. But like my issue with them is that they're really open to talk about different species like bullpinos, uh, uh, or wet fishes. But when it's about sawfish, they're really jealous or shy, or I don't know.
Yeah.
It's really tricky.
I think that they probably have concern that they might get in trouble for encountering sawfish. And I think that if you can convince them that, you know, they are helping you in letting you know where they can find them to study them, again, if they're not interested in catching them to sell them, then hopefully they would, you know, have a different attitude about it. And I will also say that one area to check if you're interested in sawfish is Lake Maracaibo used to have a huge sawfish nursery in it. And there were so many sawfish there that the Chinese actually showed up, I think in the late 1800s, and started fishing for them for the shark fin trade. So Lake Maracaibo, I don't know what condition it is in now with mangroves and pollution and such, but it used to be a hot spot for baby large-toothed sawfish. And so it'd be interesting to know if sawfish populations are still doing okay in Lake Maracaibo at all, because I really haven't seen any recent data on it.
Matthew, you have a question in the chat. Can you see it, or would you like for me to read it out loud?
Let's see. Oh, yeah. How prevalent is the trade in Glaucostegis fins related to the other rhinocristiforms? Are giant guitarfishes being targeted for their fins? Absolutely, they are. The trade name for Glaucostegid fins is Genju, and they are esteemed pretty much the same as sawfish and wedgefish fins. And in fact, they've got a separate use. They believe that, and this is an interesting element of the shark fin trade, they think Glaucostegid fins have medicinal properties and can help treat diabetes. So there's actually demand for Glaucostegid fins for that medical use. And I don't know exactly the percentage, but certainly Glaucostegids are generally much more rare than wedgefish. So it's certainly, you know, just a proportion of the wedgefish fin trade, but that's because Glaucostegids seem to be in much less numbers than the wedgefish.
looks like you have 2 follow-up questions as well in the chat.
Yeah, I have a reference for Lake Maracaibo. I'll send you that if you can give me your email address. Let's see. Oh yeah, Myanmar, really interesting question. Myanmar is basically a black hole research-wise regarding sawfish, although I have confirmed that amazingly, the incredibly rare dwarf sawfish, Pristis clavata, used to be in Myanmar, both in the south and in the north. And we have almost no records in the literature for Myanmar about what sawfish are still there. So I would be fascinated to see pictures of any sawfish caught in Myanmar, because the dwarf sawfish, Pristis clavata, used to be there, at least in the, the early 1800s. Let's see. Jezere asked if my research is mostly online or do I travel to areas to speak to people. It's both, but nowadays a lot of it can be conducted online. It used to be a much bigger deal when I started doing this, talking to people in Papua New Guinea or, far-flung areas. But now, even a lot of remote villages have internet access and I'm able to talk to people. But I do both. I do a lot of it online, but I also travel to countries and investigate sawfish lore and collect art. I did a lot of my collecting in the 1990s, which is good because now a lot of the art and things that I've got are no longer appearing. Like, for instance, I collected some beautiful fabric pieces made by women in Indian culture in Panama that hold the sawfish as basically a very benevolent, supernatural creature that protects people both physically in this world and then in the watery underworld. It protects people as a glowing sawfish spirit. And there are these shaman women that will know how to summon these sawfish spirits to battle demons that cause sickness in the village. And I was able to collect some beautiful art showing these sacred sawfish and in the 90s. And just a few years ago, I contacted the same villages to see if I could get new art of these sawfish. And the art dealer I was dealing with told me that the women didn't know anything about sawfish and didn't recognize the name or anything. So what's sad is I've seen this in multiple countries where if you have an area where sawfish are culturally important, if the animals disappear due to overfishing and too many nets in the water and such, the culture associated with them disappears too. And so you go back to those areas and the people don't know anything about them. It's just very sad. So the culture disappears when the animals are gone.
Patricia?
Hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thanks for the great talk. Really appreciate it. Have you ever heard the term white fins instead of yellow fins for sawfish? Because we're getting some seizures and they're going for white, not yellow anymore. Has that changed or it's
it seems to be regional. I've seen people use that. Sometimes it's black fin and white fin. In Asia, when they say white fin, it often means wedgefish fins, but I don't know what that would necessarily mean in Brazil. But yeah, that's one of the categories that some people use.
Yeah, they've been using white fin around here for sawfish, and it's definitely sawfish. So
yeah,
just wondering if you've seen it before. But anyway, thank you very much.
Sure.
Matthew, you've got one more question in the chat box.
Yeah. So yeah, the question is, have you come across studies noticing a decrease in sawfish size over several decades? I have not specifically seen data on that. It would make sense if sawfish are more rare nowadays that, you wouldn't be seeing, and also if they're being caught more, that you wouldn't see them growing to larger sizes. I mean, certainly the really large sawfishes that I've seen landed were, 1960s and earlier. So I think generally there probably was a decrease just because I think sawfish, less sawfish live long enough to not encounter a net. So I think, you know, where there used to be some just titanic sawfishes in certain areas, you know, even like Texas. But, you know, certainly in like Indonesia and Malaysia, we certainly don't see sawfishes caught much at all anymore. And I definitely don't see enormous ones anymore. So yeah, maybe that is a factor that less sawfishes are living long enough to grow huge.
And I'll make just a comment on that. My colleagues and I just published a paper on Pristis pectinata that has shown through the rostra samples, through all of the museums and historical photographs have shown that there has been a decline in overall size of the small tooth sawfish in the United States. So that is something we've seen. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that like the sawfish held on in southern Florida, but the population in Texas like disappeared. Although I'm not sure that there was any breeding grounds in Texas or not. And maybe they were, you know, coming up from Mexico and it just stopped with, you know, net trade, making them more depleted.
All right. Do we have any more questions? All right, Matthew, thank you for an amazing talk. That was so great. Thank you for doing that and being the first to kick off our new webinar series. As a reminder, this is recorded and will be posted on the Sawfish Conservation Society YouTube page. You can also visit our website for any information on any of the 5 sawfish species. And just one last note that, again, as today is Endangered Species Day, we all know this is a day to bring awareness to all of the threatened and endangered species across the world. But again, it's a day where we really want to highlight all of the hard efforts by all of those who work to protect all of these highly vulnerable species, and they work towards the conservation and protection. So thank you to everyone who works tirelessly to bring awareness to and help conserve all of the sawfish species across the world. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.